Welcome to the Wildland Firefighter Health webinar series. Our goal with this event has been to pull together some of the latest science relevant to firefighter physical and mental well-being, and to share some examples of how the science is being applied. My name is Vita Wright, and I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station's Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula, Montana. I'm here today on behalf of the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. The Northern Rockies Fire Science Network is part of a national network funded by the Joint Fire Science Program to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and use of fire and fuel science. In essence, we bring people together and we share knowledge. This webinar series has been organized by several of Joint Fire Science Program's Western Fire Science Exchanges, including the Northern Rockies, the Northwest, the Great Basin, the Southern Rockies, and California. We want to give a big thanks to the speakers for presenting on these important topics today, as well as the many people who have helped us organize these sessions. I would especially like to thank all of the coordinators of the partnering fire science exchanges that I just mentioned. Our topic today is mental health, so I encourage you to take care of yourselves, stand up and stretch if you need to, take a break if you need to. And to get started, the moderator for today is Ben Iverson. Ben is a fire training specialist with the USDA Forest Service's Innovation and Organizational Learning, RDNA. Take it away, Ben.
So cool seeing everybody telling us where you're from here in the chat. British Columbia, Washington, Florida, New Mexico, Colorado, and a bunch of places in between. Welcome. It is awesome to have you all here. My name is Ben. As I said, or as Vita introduced me, I work for IOL, and I'm honored to be your facilitator today. Innovation and organizational learning is really what we're doing here today. We're learning from each other. We're sharing that learning with each other, and this is a super cool opportunity for us to do that. I'm excited that we're here talking about firefighter health in general, but even more excited to be here talking about firefighter mental health today. And I'm glad to have you here for the conversation. Speaking of the conversation, we really missed the community conversation yesterday. If you were here, we didn't have the chat function open. But we felt that that we missed that. And so we opened it up today as really just trying to get as close to that community environment that we can get here in this virtual world. We still have the Q&A function up, so please use that for your questions to panelists. In the chat, though, make sure you've got it switched to talk to everyone if your intent is to talk to everyone, or if your intent is to send a direct message. We all know after years living in this virtual world, hopefully we've gotten pretty skillful at this, but we've all seen that go horribly wrong. Over in the Q&A, a couple things about that. Don't forget, you can upvote questions. That will really help me direct some of the most popular questions to our panelists. We also have a couple panelists that will actually will be requesting dialogue during their sessions, so be ready for that. If you do end up dropping a question in the chat, don't sweat it. We're monitoring, we'll take care of that. But please, as always with the chat, we have to ask that you keep that dialogue professional, and please be cautious with what you share in there. Incident details, names, violations of privacy, all that stickiness. Let's not go there today. Keep those interactions respectful. We trust that will be the case today. We're here to talk about some tough stuff. And all of these tough conversations are, well, they're avoidable. It's easy to avoid them. We've been avoiding them for years. We just don't talk about it. But that doesn't make us better. It just makes us a little less uncomfortable, for the moment at least. But what we're here today, what we're here doing all throughout this webinar is recognizing that our silence doesn't really serve anyone. We're talking about the tough stuff, and that doesn't come without risk. We may well talk about stuff today that can trigger our thoughts to go to some dark places. No one can really know what those topics will be for each of us, but some topics are more likely than others. Today, we'll be digging into firefighter mental health with Dr. Patty O'Brien in general. We'll be talking about PTSD and finding your way out of it with Marc Titus. We'll talk about taming fire dragons with Suzanne Connolly. And we'll dig into moral injury with Rebecca Morris and Patty O'Brien. And then we'll finish up with stress first aid with the famous Kim Lightley. All of this is tough stuff, right? So if any of the conversations here today, or really anything at any time, triggers a response in us, we encourage you to do whatever it takes to stabilize your situation. We're in a virtual environment, so it's really tough to watch out for each other like we could in a live event. So each of us needs to follow our plan for when we, or really those we know, anyone, are approaching or in that mental health crisis. And so I got to ask you, you do have a plan, right? You know what those triggers feel like in yourself. You know who you can call or reach out to. We're going to post some resources in the chat. If you don't have those already, take them down. And if not for you today, just add them to your pre-planning. Because I think we're all in a position where we can acknowledge that if not today, you just might need them tomorrow. So it's good to have them on hand. So with that said, and without further ado, I'm just scanning the chat again, and it's so wonderful to see all the various folks saying hello and where you're from. It is awesome to have you all here. But without further ado, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to our fantastic presenters. So Dr. Patty O'Brien, would you please come on in the room and get us started?
Hey, good morning. I'm going to work on getting my screen shared here first. Okay, looks like are folks able to see my screen?
I have you.
Okay, great. So my name is Patty O'Brien, and I'm a psychologist licensed in the state of Oregon. I'm also a former wildland firefighter, mostly spent time working with the Forest Service based on the Lolo National Forest in Montana, and also spent some time working with the HP and IOL group with the Forest Service, and just recently accepted a position working as a national manager of the Critical Incident Stress Management Program with the BLM just about last week. So today I'm going to be presenting some preliminary research data from a study that I worked on that looked at aspects of psychological and behavioral health in wildland firefighters. And I just wanted to touch on sort of broadly these terms and just sort of acknowledging kind of this overall picture of discussion of mental health in the Wildland Fire Service. And this is, these topics have become increasingly, I guess, come to the surface again and again. And so sometimes we'll talk about, or I'll acknowledge psychological health, mental health. And by that, I'm talking about different mental health experiences. So often we think about different mental health conditions, depression, PTSD, anxiety, and the impacts of trauma, and then also behavioral health. So by that, I mean the behaviors, the things that we do in our lives that impact our overall health, including physical health, mental health, and then also just our overall wellness. And all these things are connected, right? So mental health is health, physical health is health, wellness is health. And tomorrow, there will be an opportunity to hear from some folks representing different agencies regarding some of the resources and kind of activities surrounding supporting firefighters that are going on, that are in the works. So with that, I'll move on. I just want to acknowledge that this work was completed completely separate from any employment that I had with the Forest Service, with the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I should say I've worked with VA in Portland for the last 4 years with the PTSD clinical team as a staff psychologist. And all of this work was completed when I was a graduate student at the University of Montana, and was not affiliated with any federal agency, and is still not. And so I just want to note that all of the views and information expressed today is presented today is my own, and it does not reflect any position of any government agency. This study was also supported by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, which I'll get to in just a minute here. So just a brief agenda. I'm going to go over just some background about this topic in general, about first responder mental health, and then some more information about the study. And then we'll talk about what it means and looking forward. So as an introduction, we know that emergency responders, so structure firefighters, police, EMS, other emergency response occupations experience occupational health stressors that risk their safety, their physical health, and psychological health. Emergency responders experience increased line of duty injuries, death, and illness, as well as increased risk of exposure to trauma. And we also know it makes sense that first responders experience higher rates of PTSD, of depression and anxiety, of substance use, tobacco use, and also suicide. So what we don't know is very much about the specific experiences of wildland firefighters. So we can infer that maybe wildland firefighters, or that it's likely wildland firefighters also experience unique risks and unique health challenges. But our culture, our mission, our operational environments are different than those than that have been already studied well. So to date, there's very little published data that describe wildland firefighters' psychological and behavioral health. And the needs of this group are not well understood. So it's really important I'll pitch this again and again, we need more research, and we need to really increase the understanding of what the most pressing needs are, of what the risks are. And this is particularly important, as we see our fire operational environments changing. Fire seasons are becoming, are impacted by climate change. They're longer, more extreme. Fires are bigger in size and frequency. You see expansion into the wildland urban interface, with layer COVID stress into the mix there, and then also, some staffing challenges. It's a complex and evolving environment. So the primary aim of the study was just to address, start to address that gap in literature. And we did that by examining a large sample of wildland firefighters in the US, specifically looking at mental health experiences, behavioral health experiences, and then also exposure to different types of stressful events. So this was an anonymous online survey of firefighters in the US who self-identified as firefighters as having at least 3 consecutive months in a field-going operational position in their lifetime in the United States. So this could include, it included folks from all agencies, folks that have left the fire service, retirees, current firefighters, and 2,625 folks participated, completed the survey. So this data was collected basically during fire across the first season of 2018. The survey was disseminated through Lessons Learned Center, National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, other firefighter aid and or learning organizations, and the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation was very generous in providing a $5 gift card for the first 600 participants. And this was a pretty long online survey. Took up to 40 minutes to complete, depending on how folks responded. They were presented with different questions. So for example, if someone said they had never smoked, they would skip over the smoking questions versus being asked those if they said they did smoke. And I'm gonna jump into some of the measures, just hitting some of the high points here. We looked at depression, anxiety, PTSD, a number of health behavioral risk factors using very common measures that are used in healthcare settings, research settings. These are well validated and commonly used measures. So I'll just note some of the main points here. Folks that participated were predominantly in middle age, so 30 to 45 was the largest age group represented. It was mostly folks who identified themselves as male, so 83%, predominantly white, so 85%, and most folks reported having at least some college, and most folks reported being married, so 61%. And then about 10% identified themselves as veterans or former, current or former service members. And this aligns fairly well. So we know that the fire service is difficult to describe because it's so diverse across multiple agencies. But this lines up at least pretty well with some of the demographics of the Wildland Fire Service employed by the U.S. Forest Service. So of folks that participated in this study, about 92% reported that they were currently working in the Wildland Fire Service. So it's very representative of folks that were currently employed at the time. About 57% reported they worked for the U.S. Forest Service and 20% for DOI. About half reported that they were permanent or career or full-time fire in fuels or fire. 31% reported they were seasonal. And then there was just a really good representation among different resource types, including field-going operational folks, and then also folks in management or support roles. Okay, so I just want to note that using the screening measures that we did, a positive screen on one of these measures is not indicative of a diagnosis of depression, for example, or anxiety or PTSD. What this suggests is that the person is reporting symptoms that are of clinically significant severity. And that we know from validation studies that scoring above a certain threshold is highly likely that a person meets criteria for this disorder, but it is not a positive diagnosis. So all these conditions, you'll see a probable major depression or probable generalized anxiety disorder, and that's what we mean. So of the sample, 17.3% of folks screened positive for probable major depression. This falls about 2.5 times higher than the general population, which generally falls in this range of about, in the area of about 7%. And it's notable that 12.5% reported that they had been diagnosed previously by a healthcare provider with depression, and just notable that the disparity there. So 12.5% reported having been diagnosed with depression versus this proportion that screened positive. So it suggests that there's a proportion of folks that may not have, either may not be aware that they have depression or are experiencing depression symptoms and may not be receiving treatment. Probable generalized anxiety disorder fell at about 2.8%. And this is about 3 times what's observed among the general population. And this actually lined up fairly well with the proportion of folks that said they had been previously diagnosed with anxiety. Of PTSD symptoms, and this is about 4 times the rate that's observed among the general the general population. Just as a comparison, at least in one study, 15.8% of OIF veterans there is a big difference between the proportion of folks that had reported being diagnosed with PTSD by a health provider. It's 5.6% versus 13.7% that screened positive. Okay, so we also asked about past year suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts. So this is asking about whether folks had experienced thoughts of suicide, made plans for suicide, or had attempted suicide in the past year, and then also during the time frame of their fire career. So since becoming they first started working as a wildland firefighter. We see kind of similar patterns here. So as far as suicidal thoughts, 20% reported experiencing thoughts of suicide in the past year, and that falls higher than what's observed or reported among the general public. Similarly, sort of a similar pattern here for career duration suicidal thoughts. So 32% reported thoughts of suicide since at least starting their fire career. And this was higher than is observed among the general population when looking back across a lifetime time span. Plans and attempts actually fell lower than what's observed among the general public for both of those time durations. So 2.5% reported past year suicidal planning, 7.7% reported as making a past year suicide attempt. And this is actually in the range of what's observed among the general public. And it's a similar pattern there for the career duration. I want to highlight some stressful experiences reported by participants. So folks reported, 4% reported deploying a fire shelter, 70% reported having to drive or run very fast to avoid being burned or entrapped by fire. 66% reported having to run to avoid being hit by a tree or falling limb. 77% reported having a near miss or a close call that could have killed them. About 19% reported a crew member or someone on their unit was killed on duty while working in the fire service. 48% reported knowing someone well that died on the Wildland Fire Service. 36% reported witnessing an accident in which someone was killed or seriously injured. And about half reported providing medical aid to a seriously injured or dying person. So 54% reported viewing human remains. 14% reported physical assault by a coworker or a civilian. About 51% reported threats, harassment, or bullying by a coworker or civilian. 39% reported knowing someone well in the Wildland Fire Service who died by suicide. And I'm aware of the time here, and I'm just going to, let's see, note a couple points here. So we noted that binge drinking and heavy drinking, which is binge drinking on 5 or more occasions in the past month, both fell higher than what was observed among the general population. So 57% of the sample reported binge drinking in the past month. So this is 5 or more drinks for males, 4 or more drinks for folks in the study who identified themselves as female, non-binary, or who self-described their gender. And this is compared to 27% in the general population. And then I just want to make a note here about smokeless tobacco use. So about 37% of participants reported using smokeless tobacco. This is about 10 times higher than what's noted among the general population. It's also higher than samples collected among structure firefighters and active duty personnel. And it's also notable that synthetic tobacco, so it's maybe a product that's newer on the market, still falls above what's the kind of average or the reported smokeless tobacco use of 3.4% in the general population. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that firefighters reported higher rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal thoughts, binge drinking, heavy drinking, smokeless tobacco use as compared to the general population. And that these rates fall closer in line with other high-risk occupational groups or other first responder groups. So this study just provides some preliminary evidence that describes some of the behavioral health and psychological health factors experienced by wildland firefighters. And we need more data. So this points to a need for more research. And I think I want to make a note here also just about cardiovascular risk. So yesterday we heard from some presenters who noted that some increased cardiovascular risks experienced by wildland firefighters. And we also know that, that depression and PTSD and anxiety and tobacco use also increase cardiovascular risk. So looking forward here, the health consequences of these experiences are significant. The occupational consequences of these experiences are significant, and it points to a need for change. So we need change in policy, systems, training, and then also some pieces of cultural change, and which we're seeing. It's part of maybe why this presentation is happening, and we're seeing more dialogue and more kind of recognition of the mental health impacts that firefighters experience. So, looking forward, we can really benefit from more. So collaboration with different experts, from evidence-based program development, from needs assessment, health surveillance, and more research. I just want to note a couple limitations here. So these data were collected prior to COVID. There's some design factors here that have some limitations on the quality of this data or the generalizability of this data. And this is hard to study, and the sample size and sort of the national representation in the sample also decrease some of those potential biases. So I blasted through that, but I want to make a note here. This was also conducted with Duncan Campbell at the University of Montana, and there's both of our contact information. All right.
Awesome, Patty. Thank you. Ton of information in there. I think looking at the Q&A, I think we're good for the moment. I guess my question for you, and maybe I should already know this, but if somebody wants to dig deeper into your research, is it available yet? And if so,
where? There's some of it available online, and I'm happy to chat with folks if they're interested. Another big limitation is I'm working on getting this published, so it's in the works, and happy to chat with folks.
Awesome. So keep your eye open for the publishing. More to come, I'm sure. Thank you, Patty. Fantastic. We'll get transitioned here to our next presenter with Marc. Awesome. Marc, come on in the room. Introduce yourself. We're a couple minutes couple minutes ahead. That's a good problem to have. So please, sir, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I in the room? Can people hear
You
me?
are here and I can see you and hear you great.
Okay. Well, it turns out, everybody in the audience, I got a little triggered during that last presentation, and I didn't sleep very well last night for some reason. So, just bear with me. I don't have a formal presentation. I wanted to just ultimately have a conversation as best as possible. So if you have any questions, throw them up in that Q&A or Q&A window, or at the end of my talk. I hope there'll be a little bit of time that people can raise their hands and maybe ask directly. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Marc Titus. I've been involved in fire, wildland fire, prescribed fire since the spring of 1991, where I arrived at the University of Montana as a forestry student. And my red card records began in June of 2002. And so I've been involved in fire from 1991 to my last fire season being the 2012 fire season. And my so if, as you can imagine, a lot of cumulative stress, a lot of high energy environments, a lot of witness of trauma, experience of trauma, a lot of being in a management level, preventing traumatic experiences is my kind of claim to fame, if you will. And so I'm going to say that those I'm referencing, I'm going to call little t traumas. Okay, just that steady blip of high stress environment throughout my career. My big T trauma was Iron 44 in August of 2008, and interestingly enough, still bugs me, however many years it's been. So I'm not going to speak too much about the incident. Any of you all can look it up if you want to. But I want to emphasize at this point that I can picture in my mind landing on that helipad 44, and seeing a really good friend of mine at the time, and I hadn't seen him on assignment for a couple of years. Actually, he was on a Type 1 team. I was just starting to affiliate with one of the Southwest area teams. And I stepped off the helicopter and I looked down at the ground. I stepped off the helicopter and I looked up, and I ran right into this gentleman. And I was saddened to see him for the circumstances, but also happy to see him because for a variety of reasons. And I just want to say that trauma doesn't affect everyone the same way, because while 5 years after that, or six years after stepping off that helicopter on helipad 44, when I finally fell down, this particular gentleman did not. And so, Dr. O'Brien could probably speak to this a little bit in the research and what have you. And there are many instances, anecdotally as well as in the research, not only in military research, but in the first responder community, where two people can see and experience the same thing and not be affected by it. So I want you all to kind of make a bookmark of that in your mind. Because that doesn't mean that everyone is going to fall to something like post-traumatic stress disorder. But it is very real. And I'm just going to share my screen, and we're going to go ahead and we're just going to show you this image real quick. Hopefully somebody can, it's not up. We can say that it's up now. And you can see this is an image of a PTSD brain. And this is an image with no PTSD. And really, without getting into the details of it, you can just see that there's a difference here. Okay? And that's what is important for the moment. I'm going to stop sharing. You should see me. And so it is very real, and it results in physiological, biochemical changes in the body and the brain. And that is ultimately what I believe led to my decline, because as I said, in 2008, I was with the team, and then I spent another 5 years with one of the Southwest area teams, and really, in my experience, achieved my peak career achievement. I was at the top of my game in firefighting. I was an air support group supervisor. We were on fires like Whitewater Baldy. We were on the Wallow. We were on fires in Florida and what have you. And I felt like I was at the peak of my game and my career. And I thought that I would do this till I retired. Emphasis on thought. So, but eventually things did start to decline, and on assignment, I noticed my last season, I mentioned Whitewater Baldy. That was New Mexico's largest wildland fire up until this current one, which the same team that I was on with Whitewater Baldy had the New Mexico fire. But why I described that is to say that when I fell or began to fall down, nobody knew what was happening, least of all me, neither my peers as well. And so what began to happen is that I stopped functioning on assignment. I couldn't do the job anymore. And I started to exhibit what was perceived by my supervisors and my peers as kind of aggressive behavior. And looking back on it now, I realized that I was less and less inclined to allow for things to happen in my span of control that could put people at risk. And so I ended up starting to butt heads with my AOBD, my Air Operations Branch Director, and my supervisors, and started arguing for limitations, aircraft limitations, so that I didn't find myself, and I guess, again, this is hindsight. I didn't know this was what was going on at the time. This is my theory, but I was arguing for limitations in the operations environment and impeding operations. And so ultimately I was not invited back to the team. And ultimately, through a series of events, I missed the last PAC test the following year in 2013. And ultimately I stopped fighting fire that year. And so that was 2013. I was in an interesting situation. I had a new business. I had a new relationship. I was about to get married for the second time. And so I had a kind of a resurgence of my, top of my game, but that didn't last very long. And over time, 2 or 3 months, now we're talking about into 2013, 14, I started to decline again. The pressures of owning my own business and starting my own business started to affect me. And I remember being very scared because I didn't A, know what was going on, and B, all I could tell was that I was constantly under tension and stress and very, very aggressive. And this was not helping my new relationship much. And I remember waking up every single day for months, where my first waking thought, meaning before I even came out of sleep, I was jaw clenched, I was tense and just really out of sorts. And I had these voices, and I have to be careful because they weren't voices. Okay, voices means like a hallucination or of an auditory type of experience, and Dr. O'Brien would back me up on this. That's more aligned with other mental disorders, such as schizophrenia and what have you, where you actually hallucinate and hear voices. So when I say voices, I wasn't hearing voices. I was experiencing sensations, and then my mind was interpreting them. And the interpretation was that nobody, in fact, let me just go to this slide here. These were the things that I was hearing. And I'm just going to share this slide, share. And so this is what I was hearing. Nobody cared about me. My new wife didn't care about me. I couldn't do anything right. And most importantly, I wasn't worthy of good things. And this was the killer right here. And I say that purposely. They'll be better off without you. That's the suicidal ideation. And I'll feel this pain forever, and there was no hope. These are the things that I was experiencing for months, 24/7. And I remember telling a friend of mine, I remember telling her about this, and matter of factly, I thought this was normal. And I told her about this matter of factly, that I was waking up, grinding my teeth, that I thought I was going to get TMJ or some stuff like that, or break my teeth. And I told her rather offhandedly that, wow, I really just feel like there's something or something wanting me to take myself out. And she looked at me in deadpan silence and said, Marc, that's not normal. And that was the first time somebody told me that what I was experiencing wasn't normal. I had begun to think it was like the frog in the hot water story. If you put a frog in cold water and slowly bring the water up to temperature and boiling, that frog will stay there until it gets boiled to death, because it doesn't see the incremental increase in temperature. That's what was that's what had happened to me. I had incrementally got to this place, and it had become my new normal. And when my dear friend Amy said to me, Marc, that's not normal, you really need to get some help, that was my first clue. Now, second, so I did see a psychiatrist, and that's a whole interesting story of misdiagnosis and mismedication management, and what have you. So here's the thing: I did go get help, but it didn't really help, and so I kind of kept going. And over Christmas, I remember going home for the holidays, and here's the story that everybody asks me to tell, and it's this. I got into a little altercation with my family, and I extricated myself from the dinner table, and I went outside for a cigarette. Now, I was at my parents' condo in Canada, and it was dark, and it was cold, and it was winter, it was Christmas, and I had a hoodie on, of all things. And I had the hood up because it was cold, and I'm smoking, and it's dark, and I'm about 50 feet from the front door and door, sort of walking away, and I hear this voice say, "What are you doing?" And I turned around, and I'm smoking, and oh, Dr. O'Brien, I was smoking, right? This voice said, "What are you doing?" And I saw the person, and he started to harass me, right? He said, "You can't be here. And what are you little hoodlum," or some stuff like that. And I started to feel this anger and rage rise in me. And I said, "Just leave me alone, man. And I'm just smoking. My parents live here. I'm just having a cigarette. I just need some fresh air. I need to clear my head." And he continued, and he kept walking towards me, and he said something like, "You can't do this," and he called me a name that I don't remember, but what I do remember is that I turned towards him, and I started to take steps towards him, and all I wanted to do was tear this man limb from limb. I wanted to do harm to him. And at the same time that I saw the look in his eyes as he started to turn back towards the door, I saw my wife coming out of the condo, and I realized that I had lost control of everything. And I turned, and I ran, and I ran, and I ran, and I ran. And finally, about an hour later, I came back, and I came inside, and I finally ended up asking for help, and ultimately 3 days later was hospitalized myself. So these are the experiences that people can have. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody's going to go that route, but when you hear Suzanne talk about taming the dragons, she'll probably talk a little bit more about these things. So here's the thing I want to say. I have found my way home. I have found ways to ameliorate these symptoms, and I'm going to share some of that with you. But this, if you're in it, or if you know someone who's in it, or you think you know someone who's in it, remember two things. One, it's their journey. You cannot fix them. You can help them, but you cannot fix them. And two, if this is your journey, then the first thing that I had to do on my journey was admit that there was something wrong. And I remember fighting it. And my, I guess I'll go ahead and say it, my now ex-wife, second, I remember her telling me, why would you want to say that you have PTSD, Marc? I remember her saying, like, why would you want to acknowledge that? And I bought into it for a while, but guess what? Until I actually said to myself and believed it, I have this thing called post-traumatic stress disorder. Nothing I did helped. I didn't admit it to myself that I was sick. And so in order to find my way home, I started to do different things. And I come up with 4 different things that I want to share with you all now, that I found really made a difference to my journey home. And it was a long journey home, let me tell you. 1 step forward, 10 steps back. But first of all, environment. If you think about it, if you've ever been on a helibase or if you've ever run dozer line or anything like that, right? So here's what I'm going to say. If you've ever been on a helibase, we put a helibase up in a big old field and we start running trucks, doing dust abatement. Okay, after the first, run of dust abatement, the next day the grass starts to peak back up and what have you, right? So this is environment. But after 30 days of trucks doing dust abatement and all that kind of stuff, the environment for the grasses and the forbs and the things that grow there is shot, right? Everything's tamped down, matted down, what have you. And so this is what I mean. I couldn't heal in the environment that made me sick. And so what that meant is that I had to reduce the perceived external stressors in my environment so that my nervous system could go from always on to not always on, essentially. And Suzanne will probably talk about those kinds of things. But here's the thing. I want you to take away from this that if you know somebody who is dealing with post-traumatic stress or PTSD or anxiety or depression, the thing that can help them is for you or them to recognize they need a change of environment, and 2 days of R&R is not going to cut it. This is a real, get yourself on a 2-week R&R and really let your nervous system deactivate. Okay, so here's the next thing: mindset. Okay, mindset. You've probably heard of fight or flight, right? That's our nervous system, fight or flight. Okay, what is that? Fight. I wanted to beat that guy up that was telling me to stop smoking, or flight. Once I realized I was going to harm him, I ran. Flight. Okay. So mindset. If you remember, I said my big T trauma was in 2008. That was done in 7 days. Okay, but 5, 10, 15 years later, it still bugs me. And so mindset means that I have to start to change my thinking around it. And if I don't, if I think today about the Carson people that fudged the documents so that these aircraft could lift more, it boils my blood. It makes me angry, and then I want to fight. And so what I mean by mindset, a shift in mindset is that I had to start to change my thinking about how I looked at the world. And I had to start changing my thinking about how I looked at the world. And so if you're finding yourself constantly wanting to fight or flee or freeze, that could be you thinking about something in a specific way and re-triggering the initial trauma. And so there's something to put in the perspective and start to think about if you know somebody or you are somebody who is dealing with this. Now, the third thing that really, really made a big difference for me is this thing called spirituality. And I'm not going to dwell on it too much, except to say that if you don't have something to look at in the world that is bigger than you, then consider researching spirituality. There's a saying in AA, the 12-step program, which has a lot of crossover into trauma work, is that unless you adopt a higher power, you will not be able to get out of the problem. And I'm here to tell you that from my experience, that is what one of the very important things that helped me through this. Because without a higher power, it's all on me. And when I was dealing with the trauma of Iron 44, it was all on me. But once I adopted a more spiritual mindset, I realized it wasn't all on me. And all of a sudden, that was very freeing. So here's one of the last things, mindfulness. And I'll make this quick. Mindfulness is, I think, the key. We as firefighters, we practice mindfulness on the fire ground, and it's called situational awareness. Okay? Let that sink in. Mindfulness and situational awareness are very similar. There's one very distinct difference that really took me on my way home as well. As soon as I stopped practicing situational awareness, which on the fire ground kept us all alive and keeps us alive, situational awareness means we observe and notice our surroundings and we judge them and make decisions based on those judgments. And that's what, coming back to mindset, I had to change my mindset and stop judging everything. And so mindfulness really becomes all about being aware of what's going on, but not judging it and just allowing it. And with that distinction and that difference, I really started to move forward and started to get better. And ultimately, I found my way home. And so here I have taken all my time. I'll have to save the questions unless Ben allows them. But that's what I wanted to share with you today, is my experience. So that you all know it's real. And to this day, apparently, it still affects me. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. And thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, everyone, for caring about the mental health of your brothers and sisters on the line.
Thank you, Marc. Intense story. We promised the tough stuff today. I would say that, Marc, thank you for sharing. We have had a couple questions in the chat, primarily around access to mental health providers that have the experience with emergency responders. We've got some resources that we can share, but I'm curious, Marc, your weighing in on this. It's seen an improvement over the years.
I think
what do you think?
I think that with the work that Dr. O'Brien is doing, and with the newfound testament to mental health in the fire services across the country and internationally, we're going to see more and more people that are going to be helpful. When I was in it, no, there wasn't anybody that got it. And I was actually misdiagnosed the first time I was diagnosed bipolar. And it was my own research that I went to my psychiatrist and said, hey, I think I have PTSD. And she's like, no, you're bipolar. Just take these meds. So I think we're on a better trajectory. But the biggest thing I want to say is, if you find somebody you're comfortable with, like I did with the next speaker, then stick with it. Because if you find, that's really what's important, is that you find somebody that can help you and that you're comfortable with, regardless of their experience.
I think that's a great point. Relationships matter. We all have great relationships with people that have no idea about wildland fire or emergency response. So I love that. It is important, without a doubt. I agree. But so too is a relationship. So thank you, Marc. I appreciate that. Yes, awesome comments in the chat. Love seeing the engagement. I'll try to catch up with those here in a moment, but we'll transition to our next speaker as we continue to move down our agenda. Taming Fire Dragons with Suzanne Connolly. Suzanne, come on in the room. Maybe.
I don't seem to be able to start my video myself.
Oh, I've got you unmuted and saw you a little bit.
But the
ago.
host says, okay, the host has asked you to start your video. Start my video. Okay. Okay,
There
there
we
I
go.
am. Okay, great.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Suzanne. Please,
No,
the
So
floor is
I'm going to
yours.
do a slideshow. So I'm going to share a screen. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so my talk is going to be about taming fire dragons, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm Suzanne Connolly, and I'm a licensed mental health practitioner. I am licensed as a clinical social worker, a marriage and family therapist, a substance abuse counselor. But for the last 30 years, I've been specializing in treating men, women, and children who've encountered traumatic experiences. And today I'm going to present a very brief and simple basic overview of signs that you or someone close to you might be suffering from post-traumatic stress, commonly referred to as PTSD. I'll explain why reasoning doesn't work when attempting to alleviate the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And I'll talk very briefly about what can be done to alleviate the symptoms of traumatic stress and to assist people suffering from PTSD to resume their pre-traumatized lives. Many people who have experienced traumatized events have milder symptoms and may not actually be diagnosable as having PTSD. In the mental health field, we often call that trauma with a small t. However, like most things, it's a continuum, and every trauma, even trauma with a small t, can be at least temporarily debilitating. I'm hoping that by sharing this information today, you'll understand that traumatic memories are really processed quite differently than other memories, and that this understanding will help you have more compassion for yourself and or loved ones who may have experienced traumatic events. You might be wondering why I'm calling this. Oh, for some reason, my clicker is not working here. Oh, you know what? I'm not in slideshow mode. I'm sorry. Okay. Go. You might be wondering why I'm calling this presentation Taming Fire Dragons. Well, fire-breathing dragons may not be real, but Komodo dragons are. And I'm hoping that the image of a Komodo dragon can serve as an easy to remember metaphor for that part of the brain that's most responsible for the way traumatic memories are processed in our brains and nervous systems. You see, the parts of the human brain and nervous system that process trauma are very primitive. They are not part of what makes us uniquely human. They are not amenable to reason. We share these more primitive brain and nervous system parts, not only with other humans, but with mammals, even all the way down the evolutionary chain to reptiles, including the Komodo dragon. These parts of your brain and nervous system can be your best friend or your worst enemy. These parts can protect you by enabling you to flee to safety. For some reason, my clicker is not working, but we'll figure that out. Can flee to safety or to fight if the situation calls for it. But frequently that part of the brain learns and continues to protect you from perceived danger long after the danger has passed. People suffering from post-traumatic stress often feel trapped in a world they cannot reason themselves out of. You know, I cannot figure why my clicker is not working here. Okay, there we go. So the part of the brain that processes traumatic events in the body, events is part of what's collectively known as the limbic system. The part of the limbic system where highly stressful traumatic memory is stored is called the amygdala. To oversimplify for our purposes, the amygdala is where traumatic events are stored. The amygdala can activate the branch of our autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, and it activates much faster than the newer part of our brain that we can use to think. In other words, in stress situations, we can act more readily than we can think. So the fact that this part of the brain reacts so fast can be life-saving. It stimulates the flight or the fight response. However, it can sometimes have deadly results. Komodo dragons can kill, and so can trauma. Research has shown us that people who have suffered from trauma are much more susceptible to mental and physical illnesses that can often lead to an early death. Research has demonstrated that most of the hard to treat diseases like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, lupus, and even diabetes are more pervasive in the population that has been traumatized. In addition, cancer, hypertension, stroke, depression, and heart disease rates increase amongst people who have experienced traumatic events. The Komodo dragon carries deadly bacteria in its mouth. For prey lucky enough to escape from the mouth of the Komodo dragon, their luck doesn't last for long. The bacterium from the dragon's saliva leads to an early, slow, and painful death. And trauma can lead to a slow, painful, and early death as well, directly by chronic disease, as I've just mentioned, or indirectly by drugs, alcohol, or suicide. PTSD often occurs after exposure to a severely traumatizing single experience. However, men and women who are exposed to very high stress situations over long periods of time can eventually fall prey to this debilitating set of symptoms. As mentioned, PTSD can perpetuate long-term, life-changing difficulties if the symptoms are not properly addressed. Being a wildfire fighter is about being exposed to situations where often what you do every minute determines whether you live or die, whether your teammates live or die, or whether civilians will live or die. Wildfire fighters are now plagued with fires that can last months or longer with no break in sight. That's a long time for anyone's autonomic nervous system to be active in sympathetic nervous system response. Being a wildfire fighter is a lot like being a soldier in active combat. You can't escape the battle. You can't just pack up and leave. And that's not what you signed up for, and that's not who you are. So you remain rather than fleeing a life or death situation. You are there to fight the enemy, and for you, the enemy is the fire. When we're in fight or flight mode, we're running on the stress hormone adrenaline, which results in the releasing of another of the body's stress hormones, cortisol. Constantly bathing the brain with adrenaline and cortisol will offset the normal, healthy balance in our autonomic nervous system. This offset can have physical manifestations in the body and mental manifestations as well if it goes on for long periods of time. For instance, an excess of cortisol has been demonstrated to reduce the size of the brain's hippocampus, a part of the brain's limbic system that stores memory. Consequently, wildfire fighters can experience both physical and mental effects from long-term exposure to fighting wildfires. Common signs that you or someone close to you might be suffering from post-traumatic stress or possibly some minor version of stress might be experiencing intrusive memories of an event or experiencing flashbacks. Flashbacks are intrusive memories where you actually feel like you're reliving the experience. It's actually happening in the present. You might be having difficulty focusing. You might be especially anxious and hypervigilant and searching for danger at all times. Exaggerated startle response, lots of anxiety. You might be depressed and having little motivation or excitement for life. That usually happens after the adrenal glands give out from all the stress that they've been under. And you might have difficulty with closeness or intimacy. And all of these things can lead to difficulty sleeping or relaxing. If some of these things are going on with you or someone you know, it's likely that their brain and nervous system is stuck in sympathetic nervous system response, the fight or flight response. It is common that many of these symptoms can be experienced for a short period of time following a traumatic event or longer periods of extreme stress, such as in wildfire fighting. However, if the symptoms last longer than 1 month, it is then diagnosable as post-traumatic stress disorder and therapy is needed. Keep in mind that adults who have suffered chronic childhood trauma or repeated trauma in their early lives are more susceptible to post-traumatic stress than the general population, and they usually require more treatment sessions than people who have experienced a singular traumatic event. When people have new trauma layered upon old trauma from their childhood, that's known as complex PTSD or developmental trauma. And that can be much more difficult to treat. But the good news is that post-traumatic stress is treatable and usually requires only a short course of treatment. If you find a therapist who specializes in trauma, and there are lots of dragon whisperers out there that can help you tame your inner fire dragon. So if you or someone close to you suffers from any of these symptoms that we've discussed for longer than 1 month following a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, it's important that you or they get help. Following serious trauma, normal life can stop, emotional growth can be stunted, and a deep sense of hopelessness can hang in there for years or even decades. Even if you or someone you are close to is not suffering from symptoms of traumatic stress as a wildfighter or any other kind of firefighter or a policeman, you need to understand what is happening when people around you may be reacting from their ancient reptilian dragon brain rather than their rational part of the brain. A person may freeze when they should be running away from a threat. They may even run toward a threat. People may act in irrational ways in fight or flight and even be combative. You need to understand if this happens, you may need to try to calm them, but in some situations, you may need to guide them forcefully if needed to be safe. They may be reacting from their dragon brain rather than their rational brain. People suffering from long-term PTSD know that they're acting irrationally, but they can't seem to do anything about it, and they blame themselves often. It makes them feel really bad. They feel shame, embarrassment, guilt. And often people don't understand, and they'll say things like, you're making poor choices or more decisions, or even worse, just get over it. Saying like this can add to the stress of someone suffering from post-traumatic stress, or adds to their mental torture. Someone reacting is not making a choice or a decision. As a simple example of a past trauma causing reactions in the present, a person who has been hurt by people they loved and cared for in the past may panic in the presence of an authority when that person is trying to help them. They are not choosing their behavior, but they're reacting from their reptilian Komodo dragon brain. They will likely have no idea why they are doing this. The bad news is that the brain will stay the same and think the same and react the same unless it's trained to do something good, different. The good news is that our brains are wonderfully plastic and capable of making new connections and pathways if given the right treatment. Brains, even our reptilian brain, can be retrained. And all therapy for trauma involves first activating the memory and accompanying feelings that accompany the sympathetic or fight or flight response. And that's the difficult part for people. People, when you ask them to do that, often say, what are you, crazy? You want me to think about this? I spend my life avoiding it. But it's a necessary part of all trauma therapy. So simultaneously, though, the therapist will intervene by doing something that activates the client's parasympathetic or relaxation response. During the parasympathetic nervous system response, the production of neurochemicals like oxytocin and GABA are produced, which can calm the Komodo dragon brain. The brain is then tricked into rewiring the memory to a parasympathetic nervous system response, often referred to as the relaxation response. This process is known as counter-conditioning or memory reconsolidation. The memory remains. This isn't a lobotomy. Memory is still there, but the feelings that accompany the memory are quite different. Pairing the troubling memory with the relaxation response can be accomplished over time with some types of exposure therapy, such as systematic desensitization or flooding. However, kinder, gentler approaches, such as using eye movement desensitization and reprocessing or EMDR, are very effective and usually in a very short period of time. I think EMDR is one of the best ways to treat trauma for most people. Or there's another acupuncture tapping technique called thought field therapy, which is currently one of my favorites, although I do love EMDR as well. And it's often very dramatically helpful in changing traumatic memories in a short amount of time. Learning mindfulness meditation and yoga can be helpful for trauma symptoms that do not meet the level of PTSD. And they can be helpful as an adjunct therapy for PTSD. However, they're not of any permanent effectiveness for post-traumatic stress disorder when used by themselves. And of course, all this has to happen in a safe place. Rule number one in any trauma therapy is first, a safe place has to be established. So I've tried to help you see that trauma treatment usually involves some kind of exposure and then simultaneously kicking in the parasympathetic nervous system response. This way, quickly in most cases, and eventually in other cases, like in complex PTSD, the memory will be accompanied by the parasympathetic response. The memory will lose its charge and become more and more distant as time goes on. I hope that you remember that people that have been traumatized are not necessarily making choices. They're not making decisions. They are often reacting from their Komodo dragon brain rather than responding, which is a whole different kind of response. It's not a reaction, it's a response. It involves the part of the brain that makes us human. Another important lesson is that human beings are resilient and that the work you are doing is really important. The larger society needs you. I hope that having some understanding of the physiology of psychological trauma can help you stay healthy and above all, stay safe. We need you. So please keep up the good work. So any questions?
Awesome. Thank you, Suzanne. Don't have any questions in the Q&A, but please, folks, either drop your questions in the Q&A function, or we do have a bit of time. If you'd like to raise your hand and come on in the room, we can do one that way as well. Anything at all?
I hope I didn't make this all too technical, but I
Nope.
just wanted people to understand that there's a rational reason why people act the way they do when they're traumatized.
No, all good. I think we've got a bit of the intensity, and then you're bringing us down with this one. So in a good way. I do have a question in the Q&A. TFT, the same as EFT, and can you talk a little bit more about counter conditioning?
Yeah, well, all therapy is actually counter conditioning. You know, you're kind of taking the old conditioned responses and trying to create something different in the brain and nervous system. And TFT is the original tapping therapy. It's probably the more professional one. EFT is an offshoot of thought field therapy and not quite as targeted, but both of them still work. Both still contain the essential tapping points, the acupuncture points that were discovered by Dr. Roger Callahan when he developed this technique. So there's not a whole lot of difference.
Interesting. And can you speak to a little bit about why it's effective? You know, not being really familiar with it at all. It's one of those things that is like, how does that work?
Yeah, I know. And, you know, in my past, when I didn't know EMDR or TFT, people wouldn't walk out of the office saying, how did that work? You know, no one ever says, how did talk therapy work or cognitive behavioral therapy work? But these things work so quickly that people wonder how that happened. And basically, it's counter conditioning. And what you're doing is you have the person think about the problem If possible, they can give you a SUD score, meaning subjective units of distress, from like 0 to 10, kind of like the pain score you're probably familiar with. And then they're tuned into that problem, that thought field. A thought is an invisible area of influence, right? You can't see it, but it's there. You can, when a person has a good thought, they're producing different hormones and chemicals than when people have a traumatic memory. So they're tuned into the traumatic memory with all the cortisol and adrenaline going on. And then you're inducing the relaxation response by tapping these acupuncture points in a specific order for a specific problem. And you're pairing that memory, that thought field, with the parasympathetic nervous system response rather than the sympathetic nervous system response. So that's as close as I can get. You know, for most people, I just say, oh, it's acupuncture for psychological problems.
Interesting. So maybe I'm taking a leap here, and if I am, feel free to correct. EMDR, similar circumstance, just a different function.
Yeah, you're, triggering different parts of the brain, and, there's been scans and brain scans and things to show that both of them do make actual changes in the brain. Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
The theory about eye movement desensitization is having to do with REM sleep, or at least that was one, that the eyes are moving back and forth and processing the short-term memory into long-term memory, because PTSD is like being stuck in short-term memory. It's just always kind of there. People find ways to avoid it, but in extreme cases, they isolate. Like after Vietnam, guys went out into the wilderness and camped for years just to avoid any triggers for their post-traumatic stress disorder. So people can be very creative about avoiding it, but it's always kind of right there. And the idea with EMDR is putting it into long-term memory. Both seem to have the bottom line the same, that people can think about it, but can't quite capture those feelings anymore.
And we had another question in the Q&A that I think connects to what you just talked about there, with the idea of going out into the wilderness, removing yourself from that environment, and how difficult that can be when it's your profession, right? I mean, that's a major life change. Saying, okay, if being a firefighter, being on the line is anywhere near that experience, I need to remove myself from that. The financial repercussions, the loss of community, maybe all of those things. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think with good therapy, it could be a leave of absence for a short period of time, but unless it's complicated by complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is, people who have had very traumatic childhoods and just a lot of layers when their brain was being formed in those first years. So that can be a longer term therapy. And I would probably recommend that people with a lot of childhood abuse not do something like that unless they're way past their therapy, because it can be very hard. They're much more susceptible. It's one of the things we learned from Vietnam, that the people that did develop PTSD, 28% in any one situation. One of the things is, one, they were younger than the average, and the other was that they had childhood abuse. So that kind of gets reactivated when other traumas occur.
Gotcha.
But, I think if you had people that did EMDR and TFT on hand, if it doesn't go away after a short period of time, then, call in the Dragon Whisperers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good. That's definitely a memorable way to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
Have I think this will likely be our last for break, but we've got several others for you to take a look at here. But from Tim, can it be said that self-awareness is demonstrated by the presence of mind shown by breath change, tapping, or other external action?
Can it be?
Can it be said that self-awareness is demonstrated by the presence of mind shown by breath change, tapping, or another external action?
Do you mean like maintaining your sense of self while it's happening?
What I'm picking up on is maybe some sort of like a self-awareness, like knowing or noticing that moment and then doing something about it.
Well, I think that people who have presence of mind and can stay focused on what's going on probably make good wildfire fighters, because there's probably a lot going on at any one time and a lot of decisions have to be made. So that is, I think, what you would call presence of mind, or what Marc, I think, was calling mindfulness. But, I think no matter how self-confident a person is, no matter how skilled they are, in certain circumstances, anyone can develop post-traumatic stress. Some people are higher risk than others, but, enough trauma and anybody experiences traumatic stress.
Right.
Mhm.
And over in the chat, Tessa makes a good point that it's hard to commit to therapy during the fire season, even though Tessa acknowledges that might be the time that she needs it most. Maybe a brief comment on telehealth. It seems like that's a thing now more than ever, and maybe that opens up the ability to maybe think about this even when you're on the road.
Sure, because it works. I've done EMDR and TFT with trauma on online. Yeah. Mhm.
Awesome.
And there's lots of people out there now that are doing online that weren't doing online before. So,
Right. Maybe
Yeah.
a bit of a silver lining to the last several years, right?
Yes, yeah. There's a few nuggets of gold in the ashes, as they say.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Thank you for
Okay.
everything, for the questions and the answers. Certainly, thank you all for engaging both in the chat and in the Q&A. We are going to take a break, 5 minutes, get up, move around, get a drink of water, and come on back. You don't want to miss what's next. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All right. Coming up on 1:30 my time, 12:30, 2:30 your time, who knows? Welcome back from the break. Looking at what's next. Identification and integration of moral injury with Rebecca Morris and Patty O'Brien. If you would like to please come in the room, Rebecca and Patty. I'm not sure how your team in this one, so I will leave it to you. Thank you for being here and take it away.
Thanks, Ben.
Okay. Are folks able to see the screen?
Got it.
Okay, great. Okay. Rebecca, did you want to introduce yourself briefly?
I don't know if you wanted to share some of the things that you think are important.
Sure. So first of all, just really appreciate the presentations from Suzanne, and I think they line up really well in terms of transitioning to talking about our next topic, which is the theme of moral injury. And I reached out to Chaplain Morris to speak about this topic, one, because she is an expert, and also because I think that it is really important for us as a community to start to increase language and fluency around particularly the impacts of trauma. And we're starting to talk more and acknowledge more about PTSD. And we know that there's more than just PTSD. And sometimes I think it can be hard to describe, hard to label, and sometimes even, I guess, hard to feel validated in different experiences that I think are fairly common experiences among folks working in high-risk occupations and in big systems, and including in wildland fire. I met Chaplain Morris when I was working with the VA PTSD clinical team in Portland, and just feel very fortunate to have her with us today. Okay. Anything to add, Rebecca?
I think just letting people know I'm outpatient mental health chaplain in the VA system. I'm ordained as a Buddhist chaplain. I also have 2 decades of working with Native American and many indigenous traditions where we do psychospiritual initiation and a lot of integration. And I would say more and more the work that we do in our teams here in Portland is really about being integration specialists, as we know that I really appreciated the past 2 presentations as well, and the tenderness of the story and the conversations and the heartbreak of what it takes to digest that grief. And so just really naming, I appreciated the idea of the importance of adding that psychospiritual aspect, and that the research shows, and one of the reasons that I'm on the teams that I'm on nationally for moral injury is that the research shows that psychology has certain data points that show efficacy for the EBPs, the evidence-based practices that we use for PTSD in particular. And then the other piece is to be able to see that chaplaincy also has great efficacy. But when chaplaincy and mental health work together in the ways in which Patty and I are going to talk about today, the efficacy more than doubles. It's the exponential collaboration of a psychospiritual approach to really help to integrate not only PTSD, but moral injury in particular. That's the piece I would want to name. And the work that we are doing that I'm so, I don't know, honored to be able to be a part of in creating.
Thank you.
And that when we look at this presentation, thinking about what it takes when we're a human being, and that I think the idea of the heartbreak that was named, and that maybe even cocooning that you went into, and that Ben, it's hard to, not Ben, was it Marc that gave that presentation? That cocooning that you went into, Marc, where you talked about, it seemed like you had another go round in you that love was able to pull you up and out of. Yet there was a part of you that had already started this disintegration or this cocooning process. And what I loved about your story, I think, is really shown in this spiritual, psycho-spiritual depiction of what it means to digest that caterpillar and that moth are not even close to being the same beings, and that the caterpillar completely needs to die. And that you talked about the importance of digesting or eating that there's this acidic substance, gelatinous substance that the caterpillar becomes in its own dying process that becomes food for this moth. And so I've just really appreciated your bravery to and ability to share your story looking backwards. And that's really the process of integration, I think, that you've shown embodied, and the necessary piece that is often missing in high stress stakes that you all are in. So your naming of it is really, I found myself very, very humbled and touched and honored by your story. So it's what I would say is a very sacred story to be able to come through and talk about it with such clarity. And that really is, if we didn't show any more slides today, which we will, that really becomes the conversation that we are starting, and the difference between PTSD and moral injury and some of their overlaps. So I'm going to give that back to you, Patty, and let you tell us more about those pieces.
Okay. So I'm having a little trouble here. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of moral injury. And this is different than, may overlap, but maybe also distinct from PTSD. And I'm going to put a definition up here and just give folks a moment to read it for themselves. And then we'll come back and just chat about it. So we're going to ask in this presentation for a little engagement, if we can navigate the technology either through chat or if folks are able to speak up. Any initial, what stands out from this, reading this definition?
All right, folks, chat is available to you, but also if anybody would like to come into the room, just raise your hand. Autumn, the control is yours. I see Marc.
Not sure, Marc, are you able to unmute and?
Yeah, I just a quick, I don't want to take too much time of yours, but I just wanted to say that in my retrospection, for my experience, it really was the moral injury aspect of it, the nature of that Iron 44 crash, and what happened there with the company. And so I really appreciate you bringing this into it, because after the event, the years of psychological shit show in my head was all based around moral injury, and that if those people hadn't done what they did, those people would still be alive, right? So I really appreciate you guys bringing this in. I think moral injury is something that we don't or are not aware of in our community as to how much it affects each and every one of us as individuals because of the nature of what we do and the severity of outcome if anyone screws up, right? So thank you very much for bringing this up.
You're so welcome, Marc. And Patty, if you'll take the slides down. I think part of what's really important when we're talking about these kinds of very precious, Marc, you can go ahead and stay on for a second, is to be able to highlight all of us if possible as well, which is when I was listening to your presentation, I was very clear that you were talking about moral injury, and that a lot of what we are discerning is there are these things that are fear-based, and the psycho-spiritual piece and moral injury is what happens accumulated over time. And that the most important piece is that moral injury is an injury that is created as a result of community. I will say that again. Moral injury is an injury that is created as a result of community. And so therefore, part of the moral injury is the idea that you, Marc, have to heal that thing on your own, or even just with a therapist. But I'm going to suggest that a big part of your healing comes today in sharing the story with this community. The next level of integration and healing happens because moral injury can only be healed. Like you said, you couldn't stay in the same circumstance you were in and heal it. And the next imperative piece is that when you have a community injury, you think you have to heal it by yourself. And the reality is it can only be healed in community. So we'll pause, if that's okay to pause there for a moment, because we're going to continue. But I just want to say to you personally, your bravery to bring it to this community so that you can take the next level of integration, it's what people can see today and hopefully take away with, oh my gosh, I've got that too. How do we collectively heal this very silent and what we call, what I call the great secret keeper? How it's like, shut that down, shush, keep it a secret. And the bravery for individuals to say, I have this shame and it actually isn't mine. I've internalized this. And so you've helped us to start the conversation of externalizing this piece of trauma. Thank you.
And thanks for noticing that or alerting everybody to that. One of the reasons that I do speak about this publicly and it is ultimately to share with others that it's okay. It's okay that we all have this, and I before the big T trauma, these kinds of abuses, let's say, moral injuries, let's say, happen on a daily basis, generally speaking, and it's within the community that it does heal. Yes. And thanks for alerting me to that, because back when I did fall down, I was ultimately ostracized from the community, because there wasn't the awareness around mental health that is happening today. And so I found myself without community, and that is ultimately what I think made it a lot harder. And another reason that I speak about it, because if we had more information back then, maybe people would have said, hey man, you're not up acting like you usually do, what's wrong? Instead of pull your boots up by the bootstraps, like it's been, like it had been, because it's not like that anymore, or it's less like that. And I think it's important that we start to talk to people throughout all ranks of incident management, all the way up to the 40-year veterans and the type 1 IMTs and the type 1 ICs, to say, hey, look, that way doesn't work. It never did, but we made it through that. Now is a different time, and now we have to acknowledge these discrepancies that our firefighters are experiencing. Otherwise, they will go underground and suffer from a host of other problems, right?
Yeah.
And so I think
here's what I'd like to say is, we actually have to go underground together so that they aren't problems, but that they are actually digested grief. So I'm hoping, is it okay to pause here? I'm grateful at your willingness to continue the conversation with us. Is it okay to pause here and have Patty bring up a few more slides? Awesome.
all good.
Okay, so this this slide is showing just illustrating some points of topics that we've been talking about. This side of this aspect of PTSD, which Suzanne also just described so beautifully, and noticing kind of on the points here that there's a theme related to fear responses, our fear and stress activation system that gets dialed up through trauma, that gets hypersensitized through trauma. And this may co-occur or may occur distinct from this aspect of moral injury. And as Rebecca has pointed out to me and helped me to make this distinction as well, that moral injury is not so much a fear response as it might maybe anger or shame or guilt. And our treatments for PTSD don't always target those aspects. So very often we can very effectively treat PTSD, but people will say that this piece about shame or this piece about guilt or my anger still is there. And sometimes I hear from folks often things like, there's this thing that happened to me, this horrible trauma, and it was awful, but it's the way my crew treated me afterward. It's my divorce that happened afterward. It's my sense of regret, of my sense of letting people down, my fear of moving forward in a leadership role that I'm struggling with. And those parts are not part of our typical PTSD treatment protocol. And to me, that's really where those pieces of chaplaincy, of other aspects of care can really come in to support people.
So as Marc talked about, and as we're naming, moral injury happens. There's this thing that happens, and I was reading in the chat, is that there's this idea that moral injury is cumulative, and that is exactly right. So there's this moral offense that happens once, or a series of moral offenses. And in the ethos of, say, firefighting, or in our world, PTSD for trauma in the veteran world, when they're in service, it doesn't show up in the heat of something. And then as you come back home and you look at your own families, or you look at others' families, or you look at the environment, or you look at what really happened, or you look at the weight ratios of the helicopter, all the things you look at, there's this moral offense or series of offenses that causes moral pain. And that moral pain is not the moral injury. The moral pain is the moral pain. Next slide. But what happens is, when I think I have to take care of that myself, I don't have the circumstance to support that hurt, pain, anger, confusion, betrayal. Next thing I do is maybe I start to have a cocktail at the end of the night. I have sleeplessness. I internalize it. I become a workaholic. I start to notice these externalized violent behaviors. Maybe I shift to religion. I say, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, or mindfulness is gonna fix it. I isolate. I build up my resentment. I go to pornography. Whatever those reckless behaviors are, all of that becomes the moral injury. And as time continues, that snowball, what we call the moral injury ball, builds, and it builds, and it builds. And PTSD treatment can help part of it with looking at certain circumstances, certain aspects of it. And the other imperative piece is looking at the grief, looking at the violated values, being able to grieving those losses in communities, naming them, being able to be validated. So go ahead to the next slide, Patty. And so we actually have to go right into the moral pain. And that's the work that I do. I nationally train chaplain mental health teams and executive trainers that obviously can come up with money for programming, but we have a nationally recognized 10-week program that does exactly this. We go into the moral pain, highlighting values through evidence-based protocol called ACT for moral injury. Go ahead for the next. So I think I'm gonna save this really, Patty, for any depth of more questions. But there's basically this idea of this industrialized world that says more is better, bigger is better, pulling myself up by the bootstraps is better. And in the model that we use now, training nationally in the VAs, is really being able to name that there's this ego-centric way of operating. And then there's an eco-centric, which not only has the land in alignment, but it has the human being in alignment with their own land, their own terrain, their own territory. And like I said, a big part of that is the grief process. We often say, how do we get back to the truth at the center of the image you were born with? And often moral injury takes us away from that center. You'll go to the next slide. So I just explained all of this. I'm going to read a poem, and then we're going to just open it up for questions and see. So I want you to close your eyes for your own assessment. That's what the invitation is here. You know, data is data, and subjective data is data. And so I'm going to ask you in this moment to be willing to let real-time subjective data tell you something. So if you're comfortable closing your eyes, you can feel your seat beneath you, your feet on the floor. Take 5 or 6 deep, low belly breaths, allowing your shoulders to melt down your back. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you, they are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. And if you treat it as a powerful stranger, if you ask permission to know it and be known, I will caveat and say, in a similar way that Marc has shown us in a great example, the forest breathes. Your own internal landscape breathes. If you listen, it answers. This place around you has been made. In this moment, remember it. If you leave it, you can always come back saying, here, here. This is where I can find my answers. No two trees are the same to Raven. No two branches are the same to Wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. If in reading this poem, go ahead, Patty, you can go ahead and turn off the PowerPoint. If reading this poem, you think, what in the world is this lady talking about? You probably don't have moral injury. You're probably doing just fine. But if anything that's been said today is tugging on your heart and you have this sense like, I do feel lost. Some of this doesn't make sense the way it used to make sense, and I don't know why. Well, my understanding is for wildfire forest services, all of the systems are not set up and are not in place to support this conversation necessarily. And I think, Patty, tell me if I'm wrong, but that is a big part of your role and what's happening with the work you're doing. So I'll pass it back to you and let you share any closing thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions.
I think we might actually be over time, but I hope we can have a chance to answer some questions during the panel. And, you know, I would argue that increasing awareness and, you know, bolstering some momentum for different services for support is part of why we're all here.
And time does indeed fly. Thank you both. The Q&A is wide open. Let's get those cues in there. Please use that function. We stole a few minutes. I think we all sense the need to hear that last bit. So thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Patty. I'll continue the conversation. We come back together but in the meantime, that Q&A function is there. Rebecca and Patty available to answer either that platform or privately. But thanks, that was super cool, and I love the poem at the end and what you observed with how we each heard that. So, very cool. Yeah. Q&A is open.
Ben,
Let's get those cues in there. And yep.
You're lagging a little bit. There's just a lot of freezing happening with your voice. So you might, if that continues to happen, just try turning off your video if you need to, and we'll all understand.
Awesome. My video is now off.
Perfect.
And
super smooth now.
Great. Thank you. All right. Look forward to the Q&A with Rebecca and Patty. Kim, the floor is yours.
Okay, can folks hear me?
Gotcha. And screen.
Okay, so you could hear me, I hope, because you're still gibberish. All right, thank you. All right, well, coming off those heels of moral injury, we're going to dive into stress first aid for wildland firefighters. And just a little bit on my background. Today has been quite profound in the topic matter of all of our presenters. I started with the U.S. Forest Service in the late 80s and in fire, and my own path, I suppose, in fire was met face to face with on the South Canyon fire on Storm King. I was a Prineville interagency hotshot in 1994, and we lost 14, 9 of which was from my crew, our crew of Prineville. And you know, catapulting forward 28 years almost now, it's like you know, these topics on mental health for our first responder communities and our agencies as a whole is very much near and dear to my heart. As I suppose, navigated trauma piece and navigated grief injury and a lot of moral injury, and due to my own experience in wildland fire, over time I began a search to see if there's anything in our community, and this is obviously back in the 90s and early 2000s, where, you know, the culture of speaking, you know, or talking about mental health, I mean, it wasn't like something we would do. Having these types of webinars did not happen. Talking about post-traumatic stress disorder was really a silent conversation with just a very few. And it was in the early 2000s, I believe, the US Marines and US Navy were working on a model called Combat Operational Stress First Aid Field Operations. And it was a conversation that they wanted to conceptualize stress reactions for their folks. And the National Fallen Firefighter Foundation picked it up, and they made a civilian adaptation of the stress first aid model for firefighters and emergency medical services. And so fast forward, you know, looking at this model and the applicability really to all humans, we brought it into our U.S. Forest Service agency, kind of as a proof of concept in 2016, and then started having trained the trainers and involving our entire interagency partners, as well as folks outside of the wildland fire community. So the evolution of this model, you know, it's still in progress, and it's been very much received in a multitude of disciplines. And so I'm really thankful that have a little bit of your time today to present it. So Corey, if you'd like to go to the next slide. I believe. So what is stress first aid? And stress first aid is a framework, and believe me, it's, you know, we all react to stress in one way or the other. You know, we are all individuals. And so as we've heard today, there are many examples on how, you know, one person may perceive a situation or an event as stressful, and others may think of it as a, you know, day-to-day occurrence. And so just recognizing that, but it's a framework to improve recovery from stress reactions. It's a set of actions that could be used whenever needed by yourself for self-care, as well as for your peers, for those that you work with. This is not a model that's in response to a critical incident. So it's not like you use it, you know, when you use a debriefing or diffusing, but it's more of a longitudinal 365 days out of the year, knowing the pulse of your people, keeping tabs on your own self and your own stress levels, as well as those around you. It can be used for your family as well. It addresses stress reactions before they create problems. So a lot of times we want to nip it in the bud. And so, you know, if you see the stress or change in functioning with those that you work with, especially on the fire line, or, you know, throughout a very arduous fire season, you know, just perceiving those and picking up on changes of functioning, that could be those small catalysts, you know, having a conversation with that individual, or, you know, going for a walk or grabbing a cup of coffee and just say, hey man, you're just not yourself these days. So hopefully, you know, we identify needs and mitigate those stress reactions before they become problems. It fosters longevity in your job. And so if you have leadership, if you have coworkers, if you have folks that are invested in you and asking, about your, welfare, basically, it creates a supportive work environment. I know Marc mentioned the word environment a couple times, and if you're in a hostile environment, it's hard to do a job effectively and efficiently. But if you're in a supportive work environment, it makes all the difference. And stress first aid changes the stigma. So the more we talk about help seeking, the more we talk about mental health, or just basically saying, I'm not okay today. I mean, those are things that are changing our culture and changing the stigma around help seeking. And then stress first aid creates a common language to address stress. And I think you'll see this. It was a conceptual model developed by the Marines for a purpose. They wanted it easy for folks to talk about their stress reactions. So please forward the slide. So the characteristics, it's tiny steps. They're, recovering from stress injuries, as we've heard earlier in some of the testimony. These things can take time. And, we could equate it to running a marathon or even a half marathon. You have to get out there and train. I took my PAC test, arduous PAC test yesterday, and I'm so glad I'd been out hiking and backpacking and training for it, because it's not easy, after all these years. And so, it's the same thing in our mental health and our stress. It takes tiny steps. We just can't get through things quickly. And I think that's sometimes a hiccup in our society. We want immediate help, or we want to fix things, right? But this is tiny steps. Timing and context are important. So you'll see some of the actions, it's immediate, getting somebody to safety or providing psychological safety for them. Or it could be something like mentoring and, having that supportive other to help you navigate through difficult times. So again, timing's important. Mentoring and problem solving are highlighted. So there's not a recipe. It's very individual and very creative. It's not meant to address all ranges of issues. And so you'll see that we are very much supportive of, this is that peer type support, checking in with others and just, being with others to help them navigate. However, we all know that, the post-traumatic stress disorder pieces, or anxiety, depression, substance use disorders, all those types, there's that higher level of care, and having those resources available for our folks, or knowing how to get them to that higher level of care, is important. Please advance the slide. So when I was mentioning the common language, and when I first saw this slide, it was many, many years ago. And when I first saw it, it looked like one of those Smokey Bear, fire prevention signs, and you enter the forest. And what's our fire danger today? Well, it looks the same to me in regards to what's my stress level today. This is the continuum model that the U.S. Marine Corps developed. And as we were working with adapting this model to our wildland fire community, we worked with the National Center for PTSD. So with this, we have the green, and this is just mirrors. The green zone is where, all of our pre-incident training, and this is what our hope is, with optimizing growth and functioning, and folks are behaving at their best, and they're motivated, they're calm, they're steady, they're having fun. The green zone is a precious place. Not all of us find ourselves in the green. In fact, when I present this model, it's interesting to ask, when was the last time you saw green, right? Because most of the time, due to life, and especially, in the last few years, obviously with the pandemic, and then just our fire year, these past decade, we're reacting to stress. There's a lot going on, not only in our professional careers, but also in our personal. And so, reacting to stresses, it's typically mild, transient. It always goes away. Hopefully it always goes away, but we navigate this type of stress reaction, You may find yourself loss of motivation, loss of focus, not having fun, and it could be any stressor. And then the orange zone, and we've heard about stress injuries earlier today, and I want to drop down to the bottom there where it says causes. So this life threat, it could be the traumatic injury, threat to your own life. It could be a grief injury, so loss of people, places, or things that you cherish. We heard on inner conflict, so the moral injury and, witnessing behaviors that violate your moral values. And I can't say enough how grateful I am to have heard the piece on moral injury. I mean, this was a huge piece in my own recovery from the South Canyon fires, just dealing with of that type of injury. And then we have the accumulative stress. So it says here wear and tear. So long term, having, day in, day out, year after year, and really not having those coping mechanisms or strategies in place to support yourself. And so the orange zone, the stress injury, this is what I, thinking back to my own fire career and having black leg and being out on 14, 21 days and mopping up and just getting, black leg and going home and scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing and trying to get the black out of my pores. And it would take a long time. And I often kid that, my mom would give me a can of Comet and a puffy so I could just scrub and get it out. And that's where, stress injuries can get stuck. And, if we don't have those coping strategies in place or resources available or even understand how to get that, this could be where, where the role failure, there's more risk for role failure into that red area of ill. And this is that clinical diagnoses. As you could see, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, depressions, anxieties, substance use disorders. And so that's more persistent and over time. And so with this continuum model, again, it's conceptualizing your stress injuries. We've introduced it a lot with our fire crews, and a lot of times they have morning check-ins, where are you on the continuum? And it's really a good gauge on a day-to-day basis to see those who you're working with, if they've had a really rough go at it, what are your needs and how can I help? So this is the foundation for the stress first aid model. Please advance the slide. So there was a huge literature search, evidence-informed bases on when the stress first aid model was created. The literature and the researchers found these 5 core areas that help people get through difficult times in that immediate midterm post event. So as you can see here, we have a sense of safety, and this could be, your physical safety, the immediacy, in the wildland fire community, you're on the front lines of a fire, getting folks to safety. Perhaps it could be also the psychological safety. So again, the environment in which we work. So the sense of safety is a very strong factor to get through adversity. Calming, so the physiological response to stress, okay? It's normal to feel some type of anxiety or some type of stress reaction in a stressful event. I mean, that's normal. It's that longitude, if it elevated heart rate, elevated, for long periods of time, that's when it could affect your health. So be it sleep patterns or just, heart health, all of that. So calming is essential. Connect. So social connectedness is one of the most important protective factors against that orange zone stress injury. So connecting with others, regardless if you're introvert or extrovert, but being with others, positive folks, people that get it, people that understand. Self-efficacy. So after a stressful event, you could have skill sets that you were trained and were very proficient at. However, stress injuries can kind of shake that ground. And so things you used to do effectively or efficiently may not be there for you. And so, taking a time out, tactical pause, getting a mentor, retraining, refocusing, getting back on. And again, this could be time as well. And then last but not least, hope. And we heard about hope earlier, but it's a verb, it's an action word. It's that forward thinking expectation or belief that a positive outcome is possible. So having something higher, higher level, something to strive for, believing that you can get through difficult times. So with these 5 core factors, please advance the slide. The stress first aid model was created. Now, keep in mind, this was a Department of Defense, US Navy, and Marine Corps, and because it was a Navy model, they had to have 7 C's. And so we just saw those 5 core areas. So the sense of safety became cover, the calm remained calm, connect remained connect, self-efficacy became competence, and hope became confidence. And because they needed 7 C's, they added check and coordinate as continuous actions. And so now you have the 7 C's of stress first aid. So check, it's continuous. As I mentioned, it's not in response to a critical incident, but a longitudinal approach to well-being. So 365 days out of the year, checking on folks, non-intrusive, but just getting to know your people and looking for distress, change in functioning, and then coordinating, getting help as needed. So populating those resources for your people. And then, as we just mentioned, the cover, sense of safety, calming, and all this. So it looks like a very linear model. However, it is not. As you approach someone perhaps and identify some needs, that's when the actions would come into place. So perhaps somebody's just been isolated. They went through a very traumatic event. It's been 30, 60 days out. They're isolated. They're not connecting with others. So bringing that person and connecting them with others potentially could be the action that you do, or giving them some competence. So maybe doing some retraining and getting them re-engaged that way. So please advance the slide. So how stress first aid it can really look, and I wanted to include this slide just because of the creativity of it. This is how you use it. You check, and if you notice distress, if you notice a change in functioning, you approach an individual and you decide what's most needed. So I always pick on my mother because she's a safe person to pick on. But during the pandemic, my mom is mid-70s. She lives alone. She has a anxious personality anyway. And so when I would call her every day when the pandemic first started, you could just tell she had a heightened state of anxiety. And it's like, okay, Mom, how much news are you watching every day? And she's like, well, I turn it on in the morning and turn it off at night. And I'm like, okay, let's turn the TV off during the day. I'll let you watch an hour in the morning, hour at night, but you got to stop the input of media. And so that was a calming effect to her. And then I'm like, Mom, what's your grocery list? I'll go pick up some groceries for you, okay? I'll provide you a sense of safety. You don't have to go to the grocery store with your mask on and, interact. I'll get your groceries. I'll put them on your front deck. So I've provided her a sense of safety. So not only that psychological environment and safety as well. And then I gave her a job. I go, Mom, you've got a garden. You have raspberries, blackberries, and strawberries, and all your berries are frozen. I want you to take them out of the freezer, not all of them, but some of them, and I want you to make some jam. So I gave her a task to do. So she felt purpose and purposeful. And so that's just a little snapshot on how the stress first aid model can be used. But again, it's very creative and all. So with that, I just want to conclude. Thank you again for the opportunity to bring this model forward. It's been embraced not only with the wildland fire community, with our law enforcement, but then agency-wide as well. So it's very applicable to a multitude of artists, and hope you found some glimmers of good tools for yourself today. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. More great stuff. I hope my video is behaving. So as with always happens, lots of stuff to talk about. I hate shutting off cool conversations, and we want to keep going. So begging your forgiveness, that's exactly what we're going to do. We bumped into our time for the panel a little bit, but I'd like to invite the panelists into the room now. And I've, for one, and I think most of the folks from the consortiums and as many of the panelists as possible will stay on as long as we are able. So please, we've got a question for all of the panelists, but then we'll open it up to you all. So please, I'll use the Q&A, but also feel free to raise your hand and actually come in the room and talk to people. Kind of a weird idea, I know, but you can handle it. What I'd like to do is just briefly hear from each of the four panelists. Much of what we were talking about today, in fact, the fact that we were talking about today indicates a culture change, both in America and wildland fire. And I am afraid that my video is messing up, so I'm going to stop it. Also in wildland fire, could you speak briefly about where you think the culture is going? We know where it's been, we've been there, we've lived it, but where do you see culture going in the next, say, 3 years? What are we going to be talking about related to mental health in the future? Who would like to go first? Unmute and tell me what you think. Did I
Who am I
stump
going to
you?
walk over? Who?
There you go, Marc. Go for it.
I really think it's headed in in the right direction. You know, I remember watching the news, Kim, and yeah. So from your experience, and I also remember you coming to an IMT meeting in Arizona and speaking with us, and I think I met you then just very briefly. But from the time that you were involved in Stork King and I was involved in Iron 44 and some of those earlier incidents, I really think we're headed in the right direction. And I really think that I think we're going to see some massive strides here in the next couple of years, because I'm seeing now actual firefighters standing up and saying, we won't tolerate this. We need support, and it's reflected in the comments in the chat for sure. And I think that what we're going to start to see is greater peer support, like one-on-one peer support. And I'd like to advocate that peer support gets embedded into teams. Doesn't need a CISM response. Just put a peer support on a team, and have a safe place for people to come to on incident and talk on the crews. Embed a peer support, trained peer support. So I think peer support is going to be big in the future. And I also think that we're going to start to see more and more mental health professionals come online to very specifically help this wildland firefighter community. And lastly, I'll say, with the work that Dr. O'Brien is doing, I too just received my master's degree in psychology, and I was shocked at the lack of research on this community. And so as more research on this wildland firefighter community comes forward, I think we're going to see a lot more dialogue about it, supported by the research. And that's really thrilling for me to see. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Marc. Patty, Rebecca, Kim, thoughts? Where are we going? What's next?
I will jump in real quick and say, of course, I'm not I'm in the VA. And so I can tell you, based on what we've done, is that in 2015, we started this 10-week pilot. And in 2021, they bought out 10%, the national programming bought out 10% of my time to train on those protocols, Act for Moral Injury. So that's one piece. And we train peers in all that we do. So we have a peer support specialist or 2 or 3 in all of our moral injury, all of our integration programming. So there's also work post moral injury. And so I think you're right on it, Marc, is that peer support is an imperative and a very beneficial piece to the work.
Awesome. Kim, Patty.
I agree with all of these points. And I think a lot about new folks that are coming through fire and doing this work currently. And I think a lot about kind of some of my own experiences and experiences of other people in the fire service that have kind of walked that path before me too. I think our culture is changing around the discussion of mental health, but also around just acknowledgement of the realities of what this job entails, the risks that this job entails. And what I hope is that there is more and more kind of integration of like acknowledging mental health, the potential impacts to mental health, or maybe expected impacts as part of this job, and that there's knowledge, skills, approaches, leadership attributes that are part of what it means to be good at this work, that surround supporting people, taking care of ourselves, awareness, language, the ways that we approach these topics. And whereas in the past, I think it comes from the Old West, right? Of like the pull yourself up by the bootstraps. It's how, it's one way of surviving. And there are other ways, there are better ways. And so I hope that we continue that momentum. And I don't know, I hope that there's stuff that we can't even think about right now, that we can't conceptualize from where we are right now.
Very good.
I'll just share a little bit. Thank you, Patty, for those words. I had the privilege of being up on South Canyon Fire staff ride last week with 3 hotshot crews. And predominantly the talk was about mental health. And I am so excited because obviously I have the advantage of looking back quite a few decades now, right, since I started, and just to see how far we've come. And now with our hot shots, even, talking about mental health and what that means to them and their families, it was huge. It was so profound. I get goosebumps just thinking about the potential moving forward, and just that well-being piece. Yeah, so that was very encouraging. Very encouraging.
Very cool. That's a great sign. All right. Volunteers, anyone wanting to come into the room before I go to the Q&A? I know we are coming up on our time together, but if this conversation isn't more important than anything else you got going on, then come on, ask a question. Gloria?
Hi, this is Gloria Edwards. I'm the director of the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, and I'm on the planning team for the webinar. Would like to extend a deep, deep thank you to all the work that you're doing. And I'm going to get choked up. Not alone in that, I guess. The deep work that you're doing and the impact that you have. Kim, I used to live in Glenwood Springs and I visited the monument many times. Spirit bless all of you. And I didn't have a huge firefighting career. I spent a year. One of those was Yellowstone. And even though it was hot and dirty and dangerous and hard work, and a lot of community, I just think it was different then. You got to go outside, you did it to make money. You could kind of be yourself and be razzed and razz back. And what you did, even though it was hot and dirty and dangerous, it was still something different than what I'm hearing and seeing now. This is a much different world. And if we don't include all of these components for our wildland firefighters, then, this isn't going to work. And I'm glad to hear that mental health and physical health and all these tools are being brought together. And then I'm hoping that we can, our fire science networks can really push this out to all our respective audiences so that people can view these videos, and who knows, maybe your work will even go much farther than just today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. I see Steve with your hand up. Come on in, Steve. What you got?
Hi, this is just Autumn from the background. I just want to say if you raise your hand, I'll allow you to talk, but then you have to click unmute on your screen as well. So it's 2 steps. I'll allow you to talk and then you'll be able to, but please unmute and then you got it.
Sorry, question for Dr. O'Brien, just connecting to yesterday's discussion. Can you sort of talk about the relationship between fatigue management and mental health?
Sure, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to catch all of the presentations yesterday, but generally, I think that we have a finite reserve of energy, of resources, cognitive, psychological, emotional resources, and we start to get depleted over time and through experiences. And when those scales are tipped, right, when we're not eating, sleeping, being able to take care of ourselves in the ways that we normally would. And there's a cumulative impact also. And so I think, there are complex relationships between, like if we look at anxiety, depression, trauma reactions to all of those factors. So when I think about fatigue, I guess I think about sleep. I think about the physical toll, physical fatigue. I think about also just sort of the physical consequences of being on a fire related to all those things together, and food also. And then just also the emotional, psychological kind of aspect of being away from family, being away from parts of our lives that kind of get paused. And so, I mean, I think those things are all, it's complicated is maybe a non-specific answer, but I think we've heard from many folks, both through data and, or I should say, as Rebecca pointed out, through research data and lived experience data, that fatigue plays a major part in how we're doing. Do others have on the panel have anything to add to that?
I think the thing that strikes me about fatigue is at one point in time, just being tired was almost a badge of courage. So we're moving away from that. That's great. One of the things we talk about in organizational learning is that those closest to the work often have the best ideas on how to improve the system. You don't want me to come up with ideas how to manage your fatigue. I want to hear from you. We want to hear from you. So the ideas from the field on how to manage fatigue differently. Find a way, use your influence, utilize the folks in this room. We can have that conversation. Thank you. Looking at our Q&A box, I've got one here talking about off-season mental health resources that are available. The questioner notes, where I went.
Sorry, I just posted a response, so it's.
Oh, gotcha. The questioner notes that the problems intensify as you are separated from your peers, pay, health insurance, all that kind of stuff. Anyone on the panel want to weigh in on maybe some formal and maybe some informal? What can we do as peers to help with those off-season folks as they move on to the next phase of their lives? Thoughts on that?
Well, I did post a reply there because it is a challenge. I was an AD when I was actually AD. I wasn't even affiliated with an agency when I was on Iron 44, and even through that whole 5 years on the team, I was AD. So I think it's really important, and I think that a crew could get creative, right, and create some kind of text message situation or check-in situation or what have you, especially if it's a situation where people are coming back year after year. But I also think that whoever's kind of pumping this up the chain, if you will, ought to take note of that and address that. And my answer was, as the powers that be kind of come online and start to acknowledge the information that is coming up the pipe, that is a problem. I think I don't know. Anecdotally, I think a lot of the suicides are happening off season. One would have to check with Nelda on that, but it appears that a lot of the suicide stuff that's going on is happening off season, which tells me that there isn't support. And crew cohesion is a really important factor in our line of work, and it may need to be incentivized for crews to create a year-round cohesion in some way, shape, or form.
And a participant in the chat noted that some in the organization are acknowledging this and efforts being made extending the EAP program into to cover temps and seasonals, ADs, retirees, that kind of thing. Super cool change in the system over time. Kim, I see you unmuted.
Oh, I've been playing with my mute button,
okay.
But yes, Katie Mergel did mention, in the U.S. Forest Service, the availability of the Employee Assistance Program year round for seasonals and temps and that sort of thing. And just going back to Mark's comment on Iron 44, I went down to Grayback Forestry the week following Iron 44. And I remember speaking to the crews and just saying, when the snow flies this winter, pick up the phone, and just that check-in out of the blue, it means so much to folks. So I think we all could be empowered to do that. Yeah.
Looking to the Q&A box, there's a question from Pam talking about the concept she was referring to was moral injury and what Rebecca shared. I cannot help but wonder how much this concept of moral injury contributes to the Great Resignation found within Wildland Fire, and I'd argue many other places. Our firefighters experience so much on the fire ground. Have you seen, or is there a conversation in your profession about the connection between moral injury or really any of your specialties with the Great Resignation? Is that part of the conversation underway or not so much?
One of the things we find in the VA, and I'm imagining that there's a parallel, is that 2/3 of my job is working with veterans. Right? So that would be similar to 2/3 of my job, maybe working with the individuals who are fighting the fires. 1/3 of my job is towards that Great Resignation. And we just spent a 2-month project where we elicit the moral distress, the heavy-heartedness. We intentionally elicit that. And I think that, I don't know if I really know exactly if the Great Resignation is, but I think just the resignation that I know about here is that idea of you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and you have to internalize and you have to silo. And then that research shows that becomes a #1 indicator for burnout, for moral injury. Unaddressed burnout becomes moral injury. Unaddressed moral distress becomes moral injury. So the opposing research shows that if we address it like we are today, if we were to have taken a survey at the beginning and maybe at the end, that people's symptoms may go up, but their resilience as a result also goes up at the validation of not having to feel like they're crazy. So that it becomes a protective factor to be able to have open conversations like this. So that direct correlation is what comes to my mind is you all have started this conversation that is the beginnings of addressing that resignation in my experience with the VA, if there's a parallel.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, it's an interesting well, kind of subculture that we find ourselves in as in wildland fire, with implications and connections with others as well. So thank you for that. We are 10 minutes over our scheduled agenda. I'm here as long as you all are here, but I do also want to be respectful of your times. If you got to run, I get it. Great. Thank you for hanging with us for as long as you can. But if you're here and available, I'll keep going until the organizers of this great event pull the plug, or my wife does, one of the two. You aren't running away, so I'm just going to keep on asking questions out of the chat. But please, anybody still hanging with us, raise your hand. And this one comes from Gloria. One of the big challenges facing firefighters is the changing expectations of the public. The expectation is that we should do, quote, everything possible. This leaves workers with lingering shame or sense of mission failure. Is this moral injury? Thoughts?
I mean, to me, yes. Yeah, sorry, I just kind of jumped in there, but yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a conflict, right, of maybe expectations of the public. And then also, I think that the question mentioned a feeling of shame. And that's a heavy piece to carry, right? Especially in this context of like, we've done everything. We're expected to do everything. And, you know, within that, there are these pieces of risk, of taking on or stepping into spaces of risk. And so I would say absolutely.
From the perspective, the other job that I do is community wildfire resilience. And so managing public expectations is something that I think managing public expectations is something that I think needs to be addressed. Again, the powers that be as time moves on, because the public does expect that we're going to have an engine parked at every house. The public does expect we're going to take extraordinary efforts to try to save homes and property and such. And that, I think, you know, I'm not going to approach it from a moral injury component, but what I am going to do is I say it puts undue pressure on personnel and resources to make challenging decisions. And in the past, one of my colleagues has said to me, he was a hot shot in the early 70s, and he said that, you know, fire behavior and extreme fire behavior these days precludes us from being successful. In fact, we only lose communities during, you know, 5% of the events, right? I mean, we're talking about Cohen now, if any of you are aware. And what he was telling me was, you know, his theory is that part of the mental health challenges that we're actually experiencing now is that we as firefighters, you know, we see all the signs and what have you in the communities. Thank you, firefighters, you're heroes, this, that, the other thing. But then when we fail, and the failure is indicative of the extreme fire weather, we're not going to succeed. How does that impact us? And Dr. O'Brien, I think that might be an interesting research study also, right? Is how does impossible conditions affect my firefighter mental health, because we cannot do anything. There is nothing that we can do. And on the heels of the New Mexico fire that we just saw, you know, maybe there's some opportunity to dig into that kind of stuff. But I think not, you know, I think it's a problem. And I think we're going to see it become more of a problem as more and more communities burn up.
I'd like to show a slide if I can.
Go for it.
Okay. So let me know if you could see this. It's the double-edged sword of ideals. Can you guys see that? And so a lot of times when we do our stress first aid, program, we show this slide because it hits to the core. We've got strengths and vulnerabilities, and I think one of the things we see here is that loyalty piece. Your commitment to accomplishing missions and protecting others, right? Well, that's our public, that's our stakeholders, that's our force, that's our communities. And then that survivor's guilt, or the complicated bereavement after losing friends or not even being able to accomplish the mission, that sort of thing. So I think there's some communication piece, maybe it's called risk communication, but just, looking at the potential for role failure and saying, okay, we've got this double-edged sort of ideals, and just being aware of both sides, because there's some strengths in that. However, our firefighters, there's that vulnerability piece as well. And so looking at those guiding ideals, that center column, I could just see, that selflessness, placing welfare of others above our own, and yet not seeking help for our own, and then stoicism, moral code, that we talked about that with moral injury earlier, and then just that excellence piece. So, just having these conversations and front loading it as well, especially with our, new generation firefighters. Again, it's just that piece of communicating it before they're feeling it.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. We have Tim with a question in the audience. Come on in the room, Tim. Or not. Looking like Tim might not be available after all. It's up to you. Got I think an interesting one in the Q&A, and this might be mostly for the doctor in the room. Edward contributes that he feels that part of dealing with this is, if we want to people not feel like they have to hide their feelings, we need to stop calling it a disorder. PTS is a normal feeling for those who have gone through a traumatic incident or incidents. Patty or others, would you like to weigh in on the word disorder and maybe why it's there, or maybe why we might want to talk about it differently, as Edward suggests? Thoughts?
You first, Patty. I want to say something about it too.
Okay, looked like you're going to speak. Yeah. I mean, this reflects that we're working in a medical model, right, of describing mental health experiences. And there's two sides to this coin. One, working in that model and naming experiences within that model, in this case as disorders, opens up the opportunity for research, for testing, different types of interventions in a very systematic way, including medications and therapies. And it validates and names experiences that sometimes are hard to name, hard to describe, and opens up resources through the systems that exist. The other side to that coin is that it can be very stigmatizing, because ultimately all of these experiences, depression, anxiety, reactions to trauma, we can look at the whole list. They're human experiences. And as Suzanne mentioned, there's like a dose response aspect to some of these experiences also. We're all vulnerable to trauma. We're all vulnerable to depression. We're all vulnerable to PTSD. And they reflect our human biology, and we all have we're all different in sort of our own unique vulnerabilities and our own experiences. So I think, I think a lot about this in terms of ways that we can reduce stigma through our language, through the ways that we relate to each other, the ways that we approach these topics, and just awareness that it's part of the system that exists. It's part of the system that we operate in. And in some ways it's like the best we've got, and there's downsides. I'm curious if others want to comment on that.
I want to say that, as I said, I started being involved in prescribed fire in 1991, and I had my big T trauma in 2008, and then I even lasted miraculously another 5 years before my body finally gave out. And so what I want to say is that I was having normal stress responses to post-traumatic events throughout my career. And some seasons were worse than others. Some experiences were worse than others. But when you look at all the little T traumas now, leading up to this big T trauma that pushed me over the edge, then I was no longer suffering from post-traumatic stress. I started to have the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are very specific symptoms in the DSM, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Diagnosing Mental Illnesses. And I think what's a tragedy is that with all this awareness of mental health happening in the public, general public, and the wildland community, we're starting to see these terms being thrown around inappropriately and incorrectly. But what I want to conclude by saying is that the disorder aspect of it is what it ultimately, it's why I hospitalized myself, because I didn't trust myself to be able to make my way out of the issues that I was experiencing without help. And it was there that I was actually diagnosed with the disorder. Up until that point, where I could check the boxes for diagnostic criterias, I still feel like I was having stress responses, just maybe poorly managing them on my own. But I have to emphasize, there was a tipping point, and Dr. O'Brien, I'm curious to your experience of it. There's a tipping point where I went into a place that without help, I couldn't have gotten out of it. I can honestly say that, and I'll say it again. Without help, professional help, I could not have gotten myself out of that hole. And I probably would have ended up a statistic that Nelda keeps track of. So I'm grateful for the help, and I'm grateful for the diagnosis.
Copy that. Thank you. That's it's a fascinating question with both really important considerations why it's considered a disorder, and then really I think a fascinating conversation about about what calling it a disorder means for some. So thank you for weighing in on that. We've got one last one, then I think we'll call it a bit of a day. This comes from Baird, I believe it is. Hero worship by the public increases my moral injury. I'm a combat veteran as well, and I'm tired of constantly being thanked for my service. I feel like I'm being put on a pedestal that I don't deserve. So we talked a little bit about expectations of the public on us, but I'm also hearing in this question at least a little bit about the expectations that we put on ourselves. Any of the panelists like to weigh in on Baird's words or mine in that? Or did I stump you? Or did Baird stump you? This is not mine.
I don't want to be the only one that's going to talk, but I will, since everybody's remaining silent.
You guys are being so polite with each other. Thank you.
I tell you what, I can feel for you, because ultimately, we do place a tremendous, let me say it this way. We're our own worst enemy when it comes to personal ideals and expectations. And if any of us are going to fall into a trap, it would be to over expect of ourselves. And then that can be exacerbated by the public response. But one thing I've learned over, this journey of healing is that I can't do anything about what the public's going to think or say or do or want of me or congratulate me or hero worship me or you or anybody else. But what I can do is I can change my inner landscape and I can change my mindset to have a different perspective on it. And I think that's where the salvation lies.
I hear some of that stoicism that Kim showed in her slide a little bit earlier. So yeah, control what you can control, and what you think about yourself is in that arena. Of course, that's easier said than done when you're in it, right? I think we'll go ahead and call it here, unless any of the organizers want to step in. But I see a note in the chat that talks about the speed of change. We get pretty used to things moving at a glacial speed of change in government, in bureaucracies, in wildland fire. But in some respects, the speed of change is increasing. Cultures are changing. And I think we all look forward to looking back in 10 years and remembering this little conversation that's part of something much bigger than it. Thank you all. Thank you all for participating, the questions, the comments, all of it. Special thanks to the presenters, especially for allowing us to steal more of your time. It's a testament to how important you feel this is. So thank you for that. And with that, any final words from any of the organizers? Vita.
Yeah, I just wanted to thanks again for such a wonderful conversation today and being so real and open, everybody, the speakers and the participants. And we've had a lot of questions on whether the talks are being recorded. They are being recorded, and all the registrants will get a notification when they're posted. So if you want to go back and go back to any of this information, otherwise take care of yourselves, and we'll see you tomorrow.